Next, we have the subjects of Hipaa. So who Hipaa applies on, and are you subject of Hipaa? There are two subjects of Hipaa. First subject are covered entities. Second subject are business associates. Let's talk about covered entities first. Covered entities are divided into three categories. The first category are healthcare providers. Healthcare providers are those who provide you with treatment initially in the first instance. For example, we have doctors, clinics, psychologists, dentists, chiropractors, nursing homes, and pharmacies. So these are someone who provide you with a direct treatment. The second example of covered entity are health plans. Health plans are usually insurances that provide you with an insurance. So the examples would be health insurance, health maintenance organization, Medicare and Medicaid. Last are healthcare clearinghouses. Healthcare clearinghouses are the middlemen between the healthcare providers and insurance payers. Clearinghouse checks the medical claim for error, ensuring that claim will be processed correctly. For example, a patient submits a claim but submits it incorrectly. If it goes directly to the payer will just reject it. So it's a good idea to pay extra $10 to $15 for a healthcare clearinghouse to review your claim and make sure it will be actually accepted and reviewed. The second subject are business associates. Business associate is a person or entity that performs certain functions on behalf of covered entity that involves PHI disclosure. We are curious in two main ideas here. Idea number one, it's someone who performs functions on behalf of the covered entity. And we have just covered who covered entities are. Second, it involves PHI disclosure. And it needs to be in conjunction. So if you have only one, the person will not be considered as business associate. For example, you have someone delivering water to the covered entity. They provide services, but there is no PHI disclosure. Thus, it will not be a business associate. Now, there is a subcategory to business associate. If business associate provides services to another business associate that involves PHI disclosure, this business associate will be considered a subcontractor business associate. There are a few exceptions to this rule. A member of direct workforce of covered entity that is under the direct control of covered entity is not considered to be a business associate. The second exception are entities that act as a conduit to transmit PHI but have no access to it. The best example of a conduit would be United States Postal Service. They can transport patients' health information in envelopes, boxes, etc. But they are not authorized to open it, meaning they perform it, but they do not have access to PHI. In this way, they are not considered as business associates. The other example would be a phone provider that does not record your services. So they are acting as a conduit, right? This phone provider just transmits your words to someone else's phone. Now, this is important that it should not be recorded, because if it's recorded, then they act as a business associate as well, because they provide a services of storing patients' health information. Now, let's talk about the business associate agreement. Any individual or entity that performs activities on behalf of covered entity or another business associate that involves PHI disclosure, which is not limited in nature, must sign a business associate agreement. We will talk about limited in nature a bit later. But right now, I want you to remember that if you provide services that involve PHI disclosure and you provide services that involve PHI disclosure, you must sign a business associate agreement. So what are the exceptions? When you should not be signing business associate agreement? Firstly is when the disclosure is accidental. So you cannot predict when the disclosure happens. And if the disclosure is accidental, there is no need to sign BAA because that person or entity will not be considered as business associate. Next is a conduit, we have already discussed it. And third one is quite similar to the first one, impossible to predict, is when we cannot predict when the disclosure happens. Now, it's different from something that we should be reasonable predicting, but if it's impossible to predict, then the person or entity to whom the information has been disclosed will not be considered as business associate. Now let's do a summary. So there are covered entities. These are those who provide services directly. These are healthcare providers. These are those who provide insurance. These are health plans. And these are healthcare clearinghouses. Those who help you to process claims and transmit it and make it in a correct form and submit it to the payer. Next, we have business associates and subcontractors. Business associate is anyone who performs functions on behalf of covered entities that involve PHI disclosure. Between these two entities, there should always be a business associate agreement. And it doesn't work in the way that, oh, if I didn't sign business associate agreement, I'm not considered business associate. It's actually the opposite. If you perform functions on behalf of covered entity or another business associate that involve PHI disclosure, it's your responsibility to sign business associate agreement. If you have not signed it, it's your violation. So let's do some practice now. Pharmacy, would this be covered entity or would this be business associate? Pharmacy would always be a covered entity, and they would be healthcare providers. Next, we have entity that provides services to the covered entity. IT services, I'm sorry. So, in this case, I would say it depends. It seems like someone who provides services to covered entity should be considered as business associate. But we need to remember that there are two criteria. Criteria number 1 is performance services. Criteria number 2 is PHI disclosure. So the question here is there a PHI disclosure in this case? If yes, it's business associate. If no, then it's just a third party providing services, just like a water delivery that I have mentioned. Entity that prescribes drugs for patients. How do you think? What would it be? So this would be a covered entity because this entity has a direct treatment. It provides direct treatment to a patient. Prescribing drugs is considered to be a direct treatment. Google, Microsoft, Apple. What do you think? These are my favorite, by the way, because a lot of people get it wrong. So firstly, we need to identify, can this be covered entities? No. So we have only either it's business associate or it's just a third party. So in order for it to be business associate, they need to perform functions on behalf of covered entity, and it needs to involve PHI disclosure. So let's think about it. When you send an email using your Microsoft account, does Microsoft provide services to you as a covered entity or business associate? Technically, yes. They provide services of transmitting information. Thus, they can be considered as business associates if you use their services for transmitting PHI. You might have a reasonable question, but I don't need to sign business associate agreement with them, right? How can I sign business associate agreement with Google, Microsoft, or Apple? Well, actually you should. And everyone who works in Fumbles, Fumbles has a business associate agreement with Microsoft. So you should be, and you cannot be using any of these services for any PHI transmission, disclosure, or disposal without having a business associate agreement with them.